Hello, and welcome to Authors Assemble, a roundtable on advancing comic studies. My name is Randy Duncan, and I'm director of the Center for Comic Studies at Henderson State University. And I'll let all our other participants introduce themselves.
I'll go next. My name is Matthew Smith, and I am the Dean of the College of Humanities and Behavioral Sciences at Radford University, which is located in southwestern Virginia. And I frequently team up with Randy Duncan, including a partnership on the Routledge Advances in Comics series that we have edited for the last 4 years.
I'll go next. My name is Leigh Anne Howard, and I am Professor of Communication Studies and Chair of the Department of Communication at the University of Southern Indiana. That's in Evansville, and I am the co-editor of Performativity, Cultural Construction, and the Graphic Narrative.
And I'm the other co-editor of that aforementioned book. My name is Susanna Hoeness-Krupsaw. I'm an associate professor of English. I also teach humanities at the University of Southern Indiana as well.
And hello, my name is Nhora Serrano. I am the Associate Director for Digital Learning and Research at Hamilton College, which is located in upstate New York. 45 minutes east of Syracuse would be my touristy mark. And I am the editor of a forthcoming edited anthology entitled Immigrants and Comics, Graphic Spaces of Remembrance, Transaction, and Mimesis.
And part of the motivation for bringing this panel together was Randy and I have had the pleasure of working with these editors and their contributors over the last several years in pulling their anthologies together. And we were thinking about ways in which the experience that they've had in pulling these books together could really benefit other would-be scholars and a wider community of people who are curious about comic studies as an entity. And so I want to start by asking Randy if he could give us kind of the elevator pitch, if you would, for the series itself and what it aims to do and why these editors in particular responded to the call that we put out for contributing volumes. Randy?
Okay. Well, the Routledge Advances in Comic Studies series publishes outstanding research that we hope truly does advance our understanding of comics and graphic novels, both as mediums of communication and as art forms. Now, coming from communication backgrounds and seeing that for a while there was sort of a dearth of scholarship from that area, we are particularly interested in research that's grounded in communication theory, rhetorical theory, media studies. However, one does not have to be a rhetorical theory scholar to contribute to the series. Susanna is a professor of modern literature. Leigh Anne is a communication professor, but focuses a lot of her research on performance studies. So why don't we transition to Leigh Anne and Susanna talking about how they brought their perspectives together and how that led to their contribution to the series. I think you've already mentioned the title, which I won't say it and get it wrong. I'll let you say it.
Okay, so I'll start and then Susanna can kind of jump in. But performativity, cultural construction, and the graphic narrative came as a result of a couple of strange coincidences, really. I got a graphic novel based on Jane Austen for Christmas one year and happened to mention it to her. Then she started talking about the fact that she had been doing some work with graphic narrative in the classroom and that there was a lot of research in English on using graphic narratives to teach literary concepts. And so from there, it was, we talked over a course of a year or so about the work that we were doing and what we were reading, and decided to collaborate on this volume. That's probably the start of really how it came. Just a series of, oh, what are you doing? I'm reading this. What are you teaching? I'm teaching that. But then as we worked on the novel, the volume rather, one of the things that we were really interested in are ways to extend our understanding of what graphic narratives can do. So when we looked at some of the volumes that were out there, and again, not a lot of research in communication, with the exception of those in the series for the most part. You know, there were, like performance studies, there were approaches to aesthetics or aesthetic communication, that combination of verbal and visual artistry. There were some about teaching. You know, we think of graphic narratives, at least popularly, as sort of entertainment. And what we were interested in is, well, what do they do? What is their capacity to actually accomplish things? And from there, we looked at performance studies scholarship, because performance has many of the same sorts of challenges to explain how they can be therapeutic, how they can engage in cultural change. Using the work of Dwight Cockergood, we structured the novel around the 3 functions that he identifies as associated with performance. That idea of mimesis, reflecting and showing, poiesis, constructing, and then kinesis, reconstructing. The ways that we can break things that we already see, that are already out there, and reconfigure them in certain ways. And so each of the chapters in the book falls in one of those sections, and the contributors look at a variety of graphic narratives from across the world in terms of how they function within their setting in those particular ways.
Susanna,
Ours
anything you want to
ended
add?
up being a really fertile collaboration, I think, because I had been at an NEH on moral philosophy and got really interested in theory of mind. And I was curious about the kind of process that occurs in the gutter, in that blank space between panels. And I couldn't quite figure out if it's just cognitive or if something else happens. And then I started talking to Leigh Anne, and I really didn't know anything about performance studies. Leigh Anne had me read an introductory text so that I was getting a little more familiar with her field. And then we realized it's not just cognition that is enhanced in the blank space between the panels, but what happens in the gutter is really a kind of performance too. And this is how we found our approach for this book.
Wonderful. Nhora, could you give us a sense of what your text, Immigrants and Comics, is about?
Certainly. So my edited anthology started actually somewhat serendipitous, but a little bit different from the previous one. I used to be on the MLA executive board for comics and graphic narratives. And in 2015, I organized a panel on immigrants and comics because the MLA presidential theme that year was negotiating sites of memory. And it seemed a perfect fitting to a topic that was near and dear in my heart, that I was teaching and doing sort of units on immigrants and comics, or citizenship and identity. And from that 2015 panel, which I found very fulfilling and successful, it came to mind that really there wasn't anything in existence in 2015, truly in scholarship, that had a focus completely on this topic of immigrants and comics. And being an immigrant myself, it seemed natural that I should start to think about creating something, not that it would be exhaustive, but a starting place to have this conversation, because in the United States, it's obviously at the forefront of many presidential election debates in the early 21st century and throughout. So it partially came from there. It also partially came from the fact that when I teach and research, I really work on editorial cartoons. That's where I begin. I look at it from a visual studies perspective. And so it just seemed to be a serendipitous moment where everything came together. And I thought, this is what I should do as an edited anthology that would offer something to scholarship and to folks who are teaching courses, a beginning place to rethink some of the texts we have studied, but from a different vantage point, or to introduce new texts and new scholars. And so Immigrants and Comics came about in part from there. And a lot of it really has to do, if we think about comics as a space, and that immigrant space. So a lot of the contributors talk about in the collection, whether it's migration or borders, but from that negotiation. What does it mean to negotiate borders and identity while you're negotiating them on a page? So that excited me, and that's where it all began. The first idea, and then why I approached Randy and Matt soon after to say, I think I have an idea. And I found it very fulfilling doing this collection and thinking about it, because if anything, what I realized, it's the beginning of more collections to come on this topic or other essays if we think about them. And that's what I'm hoping that this volume will offer to people who will read it, is a place to begin the conversation, to give them permission to really dive into immigrants and comics. And I would say the last thing is, at Hamilton College, since I'm also faculty, I did teach a course 2.5 years ago on immigrants and comics, and I realized, why did it take me so long to do it? And it was because of the volume gave me permission to sort of approach a subject in class, which I found our students, and I should say at Hamilton College, it's undergraduates, really wanting to talk about it in comic format. And so that excites me. And clearly they had a lot to say about editorial cartoons and all these different cartoonists and graphic novelists. So that's where it began for me, and where it's ending on a really happy note, where I'm like, keep thinking about the text that could have been included. But I figure this is just opening up the discussion, is the way I look at this volume.
So all of you in your answers talked about how you recognized that interests and expertise that you had related to some topics that maybe hadn't been fully addressed in comic studies, and brought about something that helped to do that. So this is a follow-up question for anyone. What sort of scholarship do you think needs to be published in the coming years? Or another way of asking that, I guess, is what are the gaps that need to be filled in comic studies?
If I may, just because I've been thinking about this a lot recently, someone who studies editorial cartoons, what I realize is the challenge today, especially as I'm finishing up my syllabus for the fall semester, it's very easy to say, let's look at editorial cartoonists in the late 19th century, 20th century, whether you look at newspaper cartoons, whether you look at illustrations. And this is not to say that it's easy, but much easier than today, that a lot of cartoonists or editorial cartoonists are releasing it out on Twitter. The sort of variety and quality and quantity of editorial cartoons right now is really exploring something really fascinating, and how that transmission, how quick is it? And so for me, from where I sit, I feel like one of the growing interests that I think many of us in comic studies should pay attention to is, where is that editorial cartoon today? Where is that commentary coming from? Because it's not just in the papers, it's not just web comics, it's tweeting. And that's for me one area I would say that could be addressed. It still needs to be addressed. How do you begin that though? That's the the large, I would say, digital humanities project in front of anyone who would like to take it up.
And there's some interesting things happening nowadays with the blurring of the distinctions between what we normally would consider an editorial cartoon and what we would consider a comic strip. And I mean, obviously there have been things like Doonesbury and whatnot, but I'm thinking of sites like the Nib, where sometimes somebody says, I can express my idea in one panel, or it's a long strip we scroll through, by that same person, maybe the next month or something. But everything on there is pretty much editorial cartoon type of content and commentary, but it takes all sorts of different forms. So I think that's an interesting aspect also. Yep. So who else has suggestions?
I think my response to your question kind of piggybacks on Nora's answer. When we did the background research for our initial proposal, we found that there is a sort of canon of particularly successful and well-known graphic narratives such as, let's say, Persepolis, Van Home, and Maus, which dominate scholarly and academic discussions of graphic narratives. Consequently, a little bit like Nhora, we found a lack of diversity among the texts on which scholars tend to publish. It's not really necessarily a cultural diversity that's lacking, but there is a lack of variety. We seem to be returning to the same texts over and over. So in our selections of chapters for our anthology, we were really careful and mindful of creating greater variety. We have a few of the standards in that collection too, but we also have other really unknown pieces in that collection.
One of the things that, and this may speak more to my own somewhat diverse interest, but I like to see more interdisciplinary approaches. I mean, in addition to thinking about a diversity in terms of titles, when you look at the backgrounds of the contributors in our volume, you know, you've got a performance studies, rhetorician, journalist from communication, you've got several literature people, but then there are also, you have someone who teaches and works out of a world language department, and you have someone who is actually in film studies. And so they're all, you know, all of these areas are actually talking about the power of comics and what they do and what they are. I would like to see more ways to bring the conversation together in that kind of interdisciplinary way. I think that could be really interesting and helpful. It certainly was for me, and I think for Susanna as well, as we move through our conversations about our anthology.
It just opened up a whole new universe of possibilities. Once we saw the two fields coming together, it was almost like creating a new hybrid. We had these two discrete units, and we made something new out of them.
I would agree with you both. I think it also speaks to, if we're thinking of it from the perspective of scholarship, compared to, say, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, a lot of scholars are also cartoonists. We've seen that recently with many of the more recent books within the past 5 or 6 years. I'm thinking, and please help me to remember Nick's last name, for who wrote Unflattening, Nick Susanna.
Susanna, yeah.
So we see a lot already, you're right, interdisciplinary, but also those who are practitioners, which is curious and really an exciting way to approach it. All of us dabble, some of us dabble more than others, and what does that mean? So I think that bringing definitely interdisciplinary, and for me, I sort of see it from that lens, I should apologize, but also what does it mean to draw and to write? What is the graphic in 2020, heading into 2021?
I think that's been one of the exciting things that Randy and I have experienced in editing the series is certainly when we set out, we thought we knew what we'd like to find, but we've been pleasantly surprised that all kinds of things we could never have conceived of on our own have come to our attention. And that's really the exciting thing, is just how the field is diversifying. I agree with all of you. It has a ways to go, and there are a lot of exciting possibilities for it to grow into, but just what we've been exposed to so far is so rewarding in terms of seeing how people are thinking about the medium and how it messages and communicates and carries forward the human condition in its expressions. So all of you came up with the germ of an idea, but then you saw it through. And I'm just curious if there were people in our audience who were thinking like, well, I have an idea, but I'm not sure how to get it anywhere. What advice would you give to them in terms of how they could move from concept to publication? What did you learn, or what do you know from your experience that might help someone to gauge how they could do that successfully?
The process kind of reminded me of working with my students in class. When we first start on a paper, we do brainstorming together, and we fill the blackboard or the whiteboard with ideas. And I think Leigh Anne and I gave Panera a lot of business, having endless lunches there where we filled sheet after sheet of paper with ideas and brainstormed and just talked it over. And I think that would be my advice to anybody who's getting started, to talk things out loud with friends and colleagues inside their particular field of study and interest, but also with friends and colleagues outside that field, just to get another perspective.
I would agree with you, Susanna. I would also say bring it into the classroom for those who teach. Mm-hmm. Not to have your students tell you how the book should go, but more to see how it's received. I find oftentimes ideas I have for essays or the germ of a next book project I'm thinking of taking up really comes from that really innocent but provocative comment that a student makes. That sort of, that moment in a classroom where all of a sudden discussion went really well and you know that you had nothing to do with it and you're okay with it. And you just sit there and you realize you're participating. So I would agree with you, with friends, with and colleagues who are not in your field, as well as if you're in a teaching format, just to throw it out to the students. Sometimes they have interesting things to say, even when you think they're not interesting, or you think they're not understanding your point, but that tells you that you haven't articulated it well. And I think that's something really exciting for students to see the professors also working through their ideas, right? It's not just them going, I don't have a thesis, I don't have a thesis. So being honest, sometimes you get rewarded in fun ways.
I guess I would add two things. One, I think it's important to take advantage as you can of things like conferences. I mean, Susanna and I talked for months at Panera on and off for a very long time before we submitted the proposal. But then, we took some of our basic ideas to a couple of conferences, and we were able to see what other people were doing as it related to graphic narratives and just say, hey, we're working on this volume. Here's some information on the series. If you have interest in submitting to us, please do. But it also let us sort of take some temperatures, if you will, of what other people would be interested in and what they were doing, and then to use that in the proposal and the way that we were shaping the anthology. So that's one thing that I would add. Another thing that I would add really is more about the work itself. And I think Susanna and I, certainly a privilege, both of us being at the same university. It meant that we could literally come together face to face pre-COVID and talk about what we were doing and what we were reading. So we would read things independently, and then when we'd come together and we would have long conversations about each of the chapters and what was going in and how we would respond. And then we would engage our contributors in the same conversation. So there are, I think, 3 drafts, the final chapters are a result of about 3 drafts where we worked with each other, and then we worked with the contributors who worked really hard. They were committed to the project. They were committed to our process because we wanted that dialogue about what we were doing. And so a lot of times our comments were less comments and more questions. Have you thought about this? Or that makes me think about that. And we would engage with the material in that way. And I think, being open and flexible and seeing where the chapters were actually sort of taking themselves was really interesting to me as an editor. And as a writer. So I enjoyed that part. And I think the dialogue between Susanna and me, but also between us and the contributors, resulted in, what you would read in the volume. So that's what I would add those.
But it would be important for somebody getting started to think about what type of commitment they're willing to make to this. I have worked with editors who were far less involved in the editorial process than Leigh Anne and I were, which is okay too, but I think the final product will be different. We had eventually developed an overarching theme, and we were trying to realize that. And with the materials we had received for submission, we had to shape that final product that we wanted to see. Other editors might be more flexible and just let things unfold. And I admire Nhora for doing it all on her own, because sometimes I really was so glad that Leigh Anne was there to the other half, or to give her opinion. And I'm hoping it was the same experience for Leigh Anne, not to just be solely responsible for this baby.
Well, that's what I was about to ask about, Susanna, was a little bit about your process for selecting and working with contributors, and did you give them guidelines, you know, and what kind of feedback along the way? And you sort of answered that, and so I don't know if Nhora has a different take on that, or.
That's a great question. I was thinking about it. I think Routledge, the strength I enjoyed was that Routledge gave me a lot of sort of, what do you call it, guidelines that I shared with the contributors before they engaged on writing their particular essays. And so that helped. I did offer, you know, in that comments back and forth, that was also very fruitful. But I would say a lot of it is that the topic I found, and maybe I was just very fortunate, they knew what they wanted to write about, and they knew what they wanted to say once they made the commitment. That, I think, why my job as a sole editor ended up being easy in that area was because the contributors knew what immigration in comics, or immigrants in comics, meant for them, and which text they wanted to do it and how they wanted to do it, and they had something to say. And so I think in that regard, was fortuitous for me. But also Routledge gave a lot of guidelines that were helpful for them. And I think for myself, again, I asked a lot of colleagues sort of ideas and aspects, just bounced off ideas. But I think the relationship between many of the contributors and myself was all over email, and it was very clear from the get-go. I was lucky in that regard, I'll say. And I know that's not the experience for many people, but I was lucky, and I can't say that I knew them, the majority of them I did not know before I began the edited anthology. So I'm not coming from a position of I invited my friends. I did not. I invited people who I did not know. So sorry, I can't be more helpful on that answer, but I think it is the luck of the draw to some regards, but also open communication, like anything with a big project.
I love what everyone's talking about, the sort of collaborative nature of this process, right? So whether you're editor alone or you're a dynamic duo, you know, you still have people that you have to interact with, whether that's the editors above you or the contributors you're working with or the students you're bouncing ideas off of. It's not this romanticized experience of retreating to the ivory castle and coming out 2 years later with a finished product. I think the best of the volumes that we've been associated with have been done largely in collaboration. And that means that there's a lot of interaction going on among the parties involved. And it's not this isolated experience. It really is, it's communal and it's collaborative in nature. And I appreciate all that you said about affirming that.
And if I also may add, Matt, I think part of it was also, I remember there was one point a couple years ago where I had to reach out to you and say, I'm in a bit of a pickle. And you said, yes, let's meet. And my pickle was more, how am I going to address the current moment in the introduction? That was for me, with the topic I had, something I had to really think hard of how I wanted to do it, because it wasn't just my book. There are other people's names attached to this. And so I think in reaching out to the series editors to sort of ask for insight and bounce off ideas is also part of, I think, the collaboration. And just to be very candid, that's what I was stuck on. How do I get around 2016, or how do I include it? And I will say this openly, when people read the introduction, they'll notice that I very deliberately did not mention our current American president. I did everything but mention his name. And that was one of the ways I got around it. And so, but those are, I think, I don't know for you, Leigh Anne and Susanna, but those are things where you sit and you feel like you waste a month thinking, how am I going to not include 2 words? And what does that mean? And what does that say? And what are the implications? And I think that goes, you know, as I tell my students, don't spend an hour in a thesaurus looking up a word, but that's what happens. And so reaching out to the series editors, and that in this case was very helpful to give me not so much an answer, but food for thought as I, you know, started to think about it.
I think that's part of our role, to be a sounding board to people, you know, that hit bumps along the way. And it's, I don't know if this was true of Matt or not, but early on when we started doing the series, maybe a little bit of trepidation in that, you know, we don't have our hands on the wheel. We've just handed the keys to someone and said, drive that car around the track and we'll look at it when it gets back. But it's worked out pretty well, I think, in that, you know, I don't know if it was necessarily our good judgment or just we happened to get good people, but we handed the keys to some good people as editors who turned in great products. But yeah, it's after editing things directly, it was a little bit different to be that step back from it. But you know, like Nhora said, we don't necessarily have an answer, but we're always willing to listen and be sounding boards for things. And sometimes if you're a lone editor, it's just nice to have someone like that to talk things out with. Yeah.
Or to say, oh my God, what did I just get myself into?
Yeah.
Yeah, to play with Susanna's metaphor earlier, you know, it's kind of like being the grandparent of a product, right? You know, you have some responsibility for it, but you don't have direct contact. And so you're thinking, oh, if this falls through, I got to step in. But boy, you're awfully proud when they're done. You know, you see the end product, it's like, wow, this is great. You know, I didn't have to go through labor or anything, but that looks wonderful at the end. And I kind of like this. I kind of like this experience.
Well, and there's obviously a lot of interest in comics and graphic narratives. If you just look at the number of volumes that are now in this series, you know, when Susanna and I first started doing sort of preliminary talks about it, I looked at the series and there were several volumes, but it's as though there are twice as many as there were even 2 years ago. So the fact that ideas keep coming into you all and books keep coming out in form of a series really attests to the richness that this area, you know, has for scholars anyway.
I think you reaffirm the idea that it's really important for somebody getting started on a project to do careful research on series and publishing houses that publish in the respective field, and to look at publications to see if they meet one's expectations, if they look and feel like what we ourselves want to publish. And that's what we saw at Routledge. You know, it worked for us. This particular series seemed to be a good fit for us. So it's good to do that kind of background research and then to look carefully at the guidelines for submission of book proposals, and maybe to even look at some samples online or samples that friends can provide to get the parts right and not to waste time on some tangential stuff.
Well, and I will just say that for me, and I think I could speak for Susanna as well, you know, we sent out the call for papers, and the first note we got back was, I think, an email from you, Matt, saying, hey, if you haven't thought about us, think about this series. It was like, hey, somebody's really interested in what it is we're doing. We've got something happening here. And so I will just have to say that kind of positive, that interest was real positive reinforcement early in the stage as we were sort of, you know, getting our ideas together. Because yeah, you know, you come up with these things and you do your research and you hope someone will be interested. And I think I immediately, Susanna, guess what I just got? And I sent it to her, and I sent it to her as I was talking to her on the phone. You know, I was like, I have to tell you this, but I'm going to send this to you as well. And it was great. It was very encouraging for us, for me. I think I can speak for her as well.
I'm glad we could have a positive impact. I mean, you know, I think the one thing that Randy and I will lay claim to is we know a good idea when we see it. So it was a great idea, and we're so proud of both the volumes that are showcased in today's discussion. Did want to ask what you all are up to. What's your next project? I know Nora's just getting finished with this one, so it may be too soon to ask, but what's sort of percolating there? What can we look forward to you working on next?
I'm taking a break from graphic narratives, at least for a while. I'm working on a chapter for a volume on incidents in the life of a slave girl that's forthcoming in the MLA teaching series. And for that, I'm using a kind of reacting to the past approach, in which I describe the role play that my students perform in the American Lit Survey.
And I'm also taking a bit of a break. I mean, my key interest in performance tends to be about critical pedagogy and the impact of pedagogy. And then the other train tends to be about constructions of identity, whether it's personal, organizational, and so on. And so the research that I'm working on right now looks at social justice and critical pedagogy. And then I'm also working on an anthology about place and space and creative approaches writing as it relates to identity. So a little bit different from this particular project.
Sure.
After the new year, it's funny you asked that. Yes, I need a little bit of a break, but I already have something in mind for the next project related to comics. And it's just serendipitous, you can tell unconsciously. I put up my virtual background and I forgot. I'm working on cartoons from The Wizard of Oz, the relationship between cartoons and the illustrations that came about, since it's the cartoonist and that mode in Chicago in 1893. And that's truly the germ of the idea. So that'll be winter holidays to sit down and think this through. But I have a lot of notes. Have some random notebooks of where that next book project will be. But to me, it's really interesting, that moment of essentially how cartoons influenced children's illustration, this particular book. And so that's where the germ of the idea is. I'm sure after the winter break, it'll sound completely different, but that's the notes I have right now.
Randy, you got anything on tap?
Don't have a contract in hand yet, but I think we might be working on a third volume of something soon, right?
We might be.
So we think that there'll be a third volume of The Power of Comics, and that Bloomsbury has approached us about it and interested in it. That we haven't, the starter's gun hasn't been fired yet. But as far as the Routledge series, we realize that not being there in person at conferences is hindering our ability to recruit a little bit. And I learned my recruiting techniques from John Lent. If any of you have been at conferences and you presented and John Lent approached you afterwards going, "Hey, are you going to submit that to IJOCA?" And so we're always on the lookout for, particularly panels that we think might be the seed from which a book can grow, as with the panel that Nhora did, that led to the edited anthology. So we're, and I think just people are stressed out and not undertaking research projects necessarily with the same vigor they might have in the past. So we feel like we've got a little bit of a lull, but I think we might want to try to be more aggressive about some of the things that are part of the mission that we haven't fulfilled yet. I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but part of what we want to do is to get more scholarship from around the world translated into English, because scholars around the world are kind of cut off from other research that's in a language they don't read. And English isn't exactly the universal language of comic scholarship, but it's more accessible to it, and would be part of Routledge's mission to do that. So Yeah, we've had some French and German scholarship that other presses have published, and we've had a good many international contributors to our volumes who bring their perspectives. But I'd really like to see more from South America. Argentina and Brazil have long traditions of comics fandom and comic scholarship, and particularly Brazil, somewhat inaccessible because just not that many people speak Portuguese. So Latin American comics have gotten some coverage, but some of that scholarship that's been produced in Brazil, and I'm talking about decades back that started in the 60s, is still only available in Portuguese. And so for my friends in Brazil that I've mentioned this to before, if you happen to watch this, then expect us to be harassing you again soon about putting together that anthology.
And while we continue to solicit for the series and we welcome new ideas, that you and I also continue to consult on a project called Marvel Universe of Superheroes, which is a traveling exhibition that examines the history of Marvel Comics, Marvel Studios, the Marvel phenomenon. It's currently at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, but we'll be heading to the Field Museum in Chicago in 2021. So not terribly far from Southern Indiana, just saying.
Yeah.
If you make it up there.
It's scheduled to slow down a little bit in that it was a non-traveling exhibit during the shutdown. It was installed in the Henry Ford Museum, and then like next week, the Henry Ford was shut down. And so
but it is open at the moment. So if anyone's in that area, by all means, make your way to Dearborn and check that out.
And Ben Saunders is the main curator for that. And so the thing we're proud about is that even though it's just tons of fun, it's got kind of a strong academic foundation that it's built on. And it's not just about the movies. With the three of us involved, we kind of insisted that more of the comics history get in there. A lot of maybe overly long essays on media tables that people aren't going to read, but it's in there.
But we wrote them.
Yeah.
Well, that's exciting for you too. I mean, especially since this, I don't know if we've peaked or maybe we've peaked with the Marvel movies, right? But I think it's an interesting moment. People are hungry to hear and learn more about comics. I think that's what's exciting about this series, right? It brings together the scholarly interest of topics that really in mainstream people are curious about and want to read, or at least take a class in, right? As we see the growing number of courses, even in 2020, that are still existing, that are focused on comics, and that's reaffirming.
Right. Well, I want to take this time to say thank you to everyone for participating today. We really appreciate you pulling yourselves away from, I'm sure, what must be a time of getting ready for brave new teaching world in all our circumstances. But your work was so good, and Randy and I just wanted to share with a wider audience, if we could, the kinds of things that are happening in comic scholarship to encourage those who might be thinking about getting involved in it to take that plunge. And if people had no idea we existed or we academics were looking at comics in such a serious fashion, that this panel might help them to broaden their horizons and appreciate there's a whole world of really thoughtful pieces out there looking at the comics phenomenon. So, Randy, any final words?
Oh, I think that covered it pretty well, Pat. I just want to thank everyone for participating and wish we could have been with you in person and gone and hung out after the panel. But we'll have to have those beers individually now.
Thank you.
Good.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to all.
Thank you.